What's a dark family secret you uncovered? Welcome back, guys. If this is your first time, make sure you subscribe because I do these videos every single day. My brother discovered we had a sister because he was hitting on a girl at the bar and they got to talking about their parents. Turns out we have the same dad. He threatens to kill me whenever I bring it up, lol. Well, at least they figured it out before and not after. Very true. My grandfather tried to kill my dad with an axe, literally showed up to his place of work and went looking to cut him down. And somehow, my unprepared dad fought him off barehanded. So grandpa escaped and came back the next day to finish the job with a gun, but my dad didn't show up to work, so dude offed himself in the parking lot, leaving the biggest suicide note ever. I've told the story a lot of times here, but I still can't completely grasp that it and the circus of other shit that surrounded it were real. Before my granddad committed suicide, he was planning to kill every single family member in the house. Grandmom, my mom, my aunt, 2 uncles, a few more people. With more details, he had left a detailed suicide note blaming everyone for his death and his intention to kill all. Family speculation is that it was due to some extramarital affair he had and how the family was obstructing his path. My mom's family is still traumatized by this entire episode and no one likes to talk about it. I guess that trauma of waking up one day and learning that your dad, who just committed suicide, was also planning to kill all of you is impossible to shake off in a lifetime. How did they know that? He had left a detailed suicide note blaming the entire family for his own suicide and how he had planned to off them all. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he already said that. I found out one of my aunts had an arranged marriage. She wasn't the one who was supposed to be in the arranged marriage, but her sister was adamant against marrying the dude, and I guess my grandma decided to persuade my aunt into replacing the sister's part of the marriage. Aunt and the dude got married and moved away and had kids. They lived far away, so I barely ever saw them, but only as I got older did I learn that the dude was abusive to my aunt, to the point where she still had some intense mental breakdowns long after he died. My grandpa doesn't know that his dad was hit and killed by a drunk driver. He was like 2 when his dad died and can't remember any of it. The only thing he said was that he thought it involved a truck. I found the article of my great-grandfather's death when I started digging into my grandpa's family tree. I also found that great-grandpa was a result of a teen pregnancy and was raised by his grandparents. I tell him, but I'm not really sure there's too much point in bringing it up now. Nah, let him believe what he's always believed. If it's not hurting anyone else, leave sleeping dogs lie. My dad tried to run out on my mum while she was pregnant with me because he'd been embezzling money from a photography club at his workplace, then a government institution where he'd been treasurer. It was all about to come out because the club needed the money, so my dad decided to cut and run. My mother's brother and father caught him by pure accident as he was leaving the house, and my granddad, a burly Scots coal miner, got him by the throat and told him if he ever pulled a stunt like that again, he'd be dead. My dad, according to the story, wet himself right there. Rightly so. My granddad paid the money back to the club so that no one found out, and not only would my dad have lost his job, but he'd most likely have been jailed too. My mum thought that she could never trust him with money again, and so although they had a joint bank account, she had them limit his access and made a separate account to control the bills, etc. She went back to work so she could always support herself, which in those days in rural Scotland was really uncommon. In that area, most women were stay-at-home mums, so there was no such thing as childcare for under 4s. Mum went back to her job as a primary school teacher, and I spent the first few years of my life sleeping in a basket in a stationery cupboard in her classroom. At Mum's funeral, some of her former colleagues were still coming up to me and saying, "Oh, it's the baby in the cupboard." Great-grandma ran a hotel in the late 1800s near a train depot and army fort in the Oklahoma Territory. Turns out it was a brothel. Great-grandma was a madam. She must have been good at it because she left a stack to my grandma. Well, you know what they say, location, location, location. Ah, the Victorian era. Women couldn't vote or show their ankles in public, but there was a brothel in every town. Uncle met his wife during the time he was using drugs. She was a prostitute. They have 2 kids now and they're great parents. Wouldn't ever guess that they had rather dark pasts. They haven't let it visibly affect them. Good for them. Yeah, that's excellent. I was the family secret. My biological parents started having kids as teenagers. For context, when my biological mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was 21 and I was their 4th child. They quickly realized they needed to get their act together. They were already struggling financially, had countless drug issues, etc. They decided that they were going to put me up for adoption. I was a baby. I was adopted by a loving family quite quickly, only about an hour drive from the city I was born in. Coincidentally, I ended up returning to that same city for college. My sophomore year, I decided to seek out my biological family. Turns out, my biological parents separated right after I was born. My biological mum is still in and out of jail to this day, but my biological dad was able to start a new chapter. He got clean and sober, remarried, started going to church, and built a legitimate career for himself. He told his new wife about me when they first met, but didn't tell any of his children. My other siblings didn't know I existed. Thanks to the internet, I ended up tracking down his work number and gave him a call. Later on, he said, as soon as I said, "Hi, this might be really weird, but..." he knew it was me. Apparently, ever since I turned 18, him and his wife were waiting anxiously for me to resurface. They knew the day would come eventually. That evening, they sat my siblings down and told them about me. It was difficult at first, but now I'm 25 and me and him have a pretty solid relationship. That's an amazing story. I'm happy for you. That really is a nice story. I love that one. My dad was discharged from the military for going AWOL. He found out his ex from when he was like 15 had his children back then and never told him about it. I have two siblings who are twins out there. I don't know their names or what they look like, but they're out there somewhere and they're only 3 years older than me. My great aunt and uncle had a baby when they were still in the dating phase. They were in love and getting married was a sure thing down the line. However, coming from a very conservative society in the Middle East back in the 50s, they had to give up the child away to an orphanage. Once that was done, they got married and eventually had 4 children. That child grew up knowing his origins and was only allowed minimal contact with his family. He still isn't invited to family events and has a family of his own. When my great uncle passed away, I was told he was amongst the randoms that came to the cemetery to pay respects. None of my cousins, including myself, know what he looks like, but my dad and his siblings and cousins all do. It's sad how he's punished for something that isn't his fault. My great aunt was a nurse at a mental hospital about 100 years ago. She fell in love with a guy who had been committed there by the state. She helped him escape and they ran off together to another part of the country. Turns out the guy was a psycho murderer and he got extradited back and put in prison. My aunt, a sweet old soul, lived to be 99 years old and I never knew anything about her past until decades after she was gone. This is like Harley and Joker. My one cool uncle came to our house every Christmas. Thanksgiving was always really great and pleasant. Had a bunch of cats and dogs at his house. Was married to my aunt shortly before I was born. So one day my mom and I went to visit him and my aunt at his house and there's this girl there and I think she was a year older than me, so about 15. My mom and I are like, "Who's this girl?" And my uncle is like, "Well, I just found out a few days ago that I have a daughter, so I guess this is your cousin." Turns out that before my uncle and aunt got married, my uncle had a pretty wild bachelor party in which a prostitute was hired. One thing led to another, and my cousin appears 15 years later to find her father. She was so sweet, and my uncle was actually really good about the whole situation. He even started paying child support to my cousin's mom, his idea. My aunt was also very forgiving. I've never met my cousin's mom. That had a surprisingly wholesome ending. My cousin didn't leave the family for 10 years because of her parents' divorce, like my parents said. She left the family for 10 years because she and her dad got into an argument and he physically shoved her into a basement, locked her inside and refused to let her out. He eventually got charged with DV and she left the family because too many people were blaming her for getting her dad arrested. I need to clarify because I'm realizing I worded this poorly. My cousin wasn't locked in the basement for 10 years. She was pissed that her dad locked her up and that the family sided with him and she stopped talking to everyone for 10 years. She was in the basement for a few hours, as I understand it. I hope your cousin is okay now. She is. She's married to a really nice guy and has 2 kids who she adores. This all happened about 20 years ago and she's doing really good now. My paternal grandfather was a d***head. Cheated on his wife like it was a job, had so many kids he literally didn't know how many he had. One estimate was about 35 to 40 and this was in the 80s. The youngest one is now 18 years old. The oldest one, my pops, is 64. As if cheating weren't bad enough, he also beat his wife and neglected his 2 legitimate kids. Thankfully, my dad turned out quite well and he's a loving father. My father had a relationship with my mother's brother. It almost got him kicked out of the Air Force. Read it at first as brother's mother and I was like, what's so weird about that? And then I realized what it actually said. Way different. I thought it said the father's mother's brother and I was like, what the f***? We have a set of plates our family uses only on Easter. My mum always fusses that they are great-grandmother pre-World War I family heirlooms. As someone who is interested in this kind of stuff, I looked up the maker's mark, 1940s kitsch at best. I haven't told anyone because I had my eyes on another set of china, and I want to seem magnanimous when I compromise with my sister to have these. 7 steps ahead. I like it. Come hell or high water, I'm getting that Christmas set. My grandpa was married to Mary Jane, fake name obviously. Mary Jane committed embezzlement and went to jail for it. She only did it to get more money for her family, although she continued to do it after the need had passed. She went to prison and got leukemia. While she was in prison dying of cancer, my grandpa divorced her. A while later, we got a wedding invitation from my grandpa, 2 days before the wedding, and can you guess who he was marrying? Mary Jane, a different one. His new wife has the exact same name as his old one. Bruh. That's brand loyalty. Great-grandmother was initially married with my great-grandfather's father, and she and my great-grandfather, her stepson, would secretly have relations until they, of course, ran off together. Both great-grandparents are still alive and happily married. Oh boy, here we go. My family could have been worth millions. My grandpa's father, my great-grandfather, had built a company from the ground up called Johnson Corrugated. We made corrugated cardboard for shipping boxes. Great-grandfather was a major but had built the family empire, so we still see him in a good way. My grandfather was supposed to inherit the company 30-something years ago until Uncle Randy happened. My great-grandmother was still alive and was technically owner of the company. She was also blind and deaf. Uncle Randy comes in impersonating my grandfather and has her sign away the entire company over to him. He gives half of the $50 million to his son, who flees to Europe after the death threats. Randy dies within the month after fleeing the family from cancer. Nobody went to his funeral, and we pissed in his grave. My grandpa is 80 and can't retire because he's been fighting this in court for the past 20 years and owes about $300,000 in legal fees. Randy. I found this out after stumbling into a stack of legal documents in my grandpa's attic. We still don't know where Randy's son is to this day. That is crazy. My mom was married at least 7 times throughout her life. I only knew of about 4 of them before this. Before this what? My dad's sister wasn't his sibling at all. It was his cousin, as the aunt was super religious and wouldn't have tolerated a teenage pregnancy, so his aunt gave her daughter to my grandparents and they raised her as her own. Found that out not too long ago. Not that big of a deal, but it was pretty woe-inducing. My great aunt is the same, not actually my grandpa's sister, but his niece. My mom told me, but apparently it's not talked about because her real siblings don't like it being brought up about their mom having a baby at 16. They pretend it's not true. Everyone just goes with the story that was given by the great-grandparents, and my great aunt fully accepts it because she grew up thinking that. So, oh well. My grandmother has a sister who died in the 60s. She never married. She was born in the army in World War II. When my grandmother turned 100, we were looking at old albums together, chatting. She was telling me all the stories. I went up on a chair to get another album for her, and I found a little book at the back of the closet. It had pictures of my father's aunt in an army aircraft, like a fighter plane, and of a few other people. On one page there was written just a few words. Yours for all eternity. My gran absolutely panicked when I was holding that book, said that nobody had ever seen it and she had promised to take it to her grave. She then told me that she believed that her sister met someone in the war, man or woman, we don't know, and that he or she was killed and that she had decided to never fall in love again. I never told anyone before a few weeks ago. My father asked if there was anything missing from her house that I would have wanted. The book has gone because nobody thought it was important when the house was cleaned out, and I really think my gran would have been happy about that. She died aged 102, having lived through 2 world wars. She's my hero. Similar thing happened when my family was cleaning out my grandma's house after she died. My dad said he found letters to my grandma from a soldier saying things like how he couldn't wait to see her again, etc. My grandparents had gotten married in 1939, but my grandfather served in Europe in World War II at some point. Meanwhile, the town my family lived in at the time was used as an army rehab centre, so there were soldiers everywhere for a few years. My grandparents also got divorced shortly after my dad was born in 1945, and no one ever talked about it, and my dad barely knew his dad growing up. My dad surprisingly didn't think too much of the letters, just like, haha, that's weird, but it seriously made me wonder if my grandma had an affair with a recovering soldier while my grandpa was overseas, and since my dad was born right in the middle of wartime, if this other guy is his real dad and that's why my grandparents divorced. Wow, that is a theory. I was always told that my dad left me when I was born, and technically it's still true, but I was told my dad was someone completely different. I got a little suspicious about the whole thing because my cousin, who apparently didn't know the whole cover story, told me that my dad had blonde hair and my mother had black, and that's where I get my black hair, but everyone else told me that my dad had black hair. I thought about it and had a few suspicious thoughts about the whole thing, and then what really revealed it to me was I had to use my birth certificate so I could join the military, and the name of my father said Alexander Smith, and my last name is Smith, but they all told me that I got my name from a baby book, so that's why my last name was different from everyone else's in my family. I then spent a couple days doing research on an Alexander Smith and found out that everything added up. He was born in Russia and changed his name when he got here, and I'm 70% Russian, so that makes a lot more sense with that. And what sold it for me is that it said his mother's name was Natasha Kelovich, which was my grandmother's name. I confronted my family about it and they revealed that yes, he is my dad, and they told me what happened. To put it short, after I was born, he didn't want any kids, so he tried to smother me in my sleep when I was just a little child. When he was stopped by my brother and my uncle, he left and they called the police on him. He later returned in the middle of the night and set fire to our house and killed our family dog, and the fire jumped to another house and killed an old lady in the process. After that, he was arrested and sent to prison for life. He later died in prison. They said they wanted to keep it a secret, so I didn't know my dad was a psychopath murderer who wanted to try and kill me. They were planning on telling me over letter when I joined the military, but I figured that out beforehand. I'll take the worst ideas ever of all time for 500, Alex.